Hey there folks, welcome to Spectrum Pulse. We talk about music, movies, art, and culture. And today we're finally going to be talking about the newest album from Radiohead, the surprise album, A Moon-Shaped Pool. You know, most of the time, I have absolutely no issue going against the critical consensus. Sure, it's nice to know that my opinions are echoed by the majority popular opinion, but I've taken some hard and controversial stances before, and I'm not afraid to stand by them. I found albums that critics adored to be tedious or mediocre or even quite bad, and I found some albums that were critically savage to be hidden gems. After all, as much as critics like myself like to think that we're the ones who can shape history, reality often proves to be vastly different. And yet, when we get to Radiohead, god damn it, I wish I liked this band a lot more than I do. The way I've always described the critically beloved group is that I respect them a fair bit more than I actually like them. I can appreciate what they did to push boundaries in alternative rock and blending in electronica throughout the 90s and 2000s, but in terms of the albums themselves, my favorite Radiohead album has always been The Bends. And while OK Computer and In Rainbows definitely have their moments and are kind of great albums in their own right, I've never really been able to get passionate about this group. A big part of it is Thom Yorke himself. I can appreciate his expressive delivery to a point, but I've never found him to be the profound or interesting songwriter that so many have emphasized. And sure, melodically, Radiohead have put together some potent moments and some great songs, but when pushed through every shade of melancholy in the book, especially with the increasingly diminished returns of the 2000s, the material just doesn't really connect with me. Hell, I argue part of it started off with Kid A. Certainly a good album with some spectacular moments, but not worth the oceans of praise the majority of critics, especially Pitchfork, ejaculated all over it in 2000. And no, it wasn't going electronic that hurt Radiohead for me. In Rainbows found a synthesis of it that was looser, more melodic, and really quite potent. It really is the brighter side to OK Computer. But I will say that the more humanity and organic instrumentation Radiohead tends to embrace, the more their gift for melody comes to the forefront. Something which their 2011 record, The King of Limbs, didn't really emphasize all that effectively in his choice to play for choppy, looped rhythms and grooves and a lot of minimalism. So when I heard that their surprise new release, A Moon-Shaped Pool, was going back towards more organic instrumentation, perhaps even bringing in elements of folk that they flirted with in the past but never completely embraced for decades, yeah, I was intrigued. And even though I'm decidedly in the minority when it comes to Radiohead albums, I figured I still like the group enough to really dig in. So what did I find with A Moon-Shaped Pool? Well, I like it more than The King of Limbs, that's for sure. But granted, if that's the standard for which we're holding Radiohead these days, anything's gonna be an improvement. But you know what, even that's not quite fair, because A Moon-Shaped Pool is indeed very listenable and melodically satisfying, I guess, in the melancholic way that so much of Radiohead's music is. But it's not an album I say rise to the heights of their best or makes me a fan of the group. It's fine, it's decent, it's pleasant, it's got its moments, but I'm not wowed or all that impressed by it, and it pretty much fails to satisfy me on pretty much every level. So yeah, it's maybe pretty good, but not great at all. So I should explain. Let's start off with the factor where I'll immediately alienate a whole crop of Radiohead fans. Thom Yorke does absolutely nothing for me on this album. Oh sure, he's plaintive and expressive with that trembling mews in his voice, but I've never been wild about his vocals, and pretty much nothing changes with that here. Of course, by Radiohead standards, he sounds fine, outside of a few gimmicks like when they reverse his vocals on Daydreaming, or shove in some awkwardly layered pieces like on Present Tense. He's very much comfortable and in his wheelhouse for as much as you could expect for him. But I've never really been able to find much about Thom Yorke's delivery that grips me, and that doesn't really change here. I will say I dug some of the symphonic backing vocals that showed up on Dex Dark, Identikit, the second half of Present Tense, but beyond that, Thom Yorke just does not grip me. There's something sexless and lacking in soul that just doesn't click for me. And that's a big problem, because a lot of the instrumentation didn't really grab much attention from me either. For as much buzz as Radiohead got going for more of a rich acoustic sound, I'm not entirely convinced that the hype was worth it, most because it translates to some more acoustic guitar and some well-placed string sections. And yes, it's all got great smooth texture. A lot of grit, but I've learned not to expect that from Radiohead in recent years. And when the strings and very muted keys built with some swell, it tends to work. The ragged, pluckier strings actually come from a technique where the musicians hit the strings with the bow rather than saw at them on Burn the Rich. The meteor string section on The Numbers is probably my favorite song there with guitar groove. And the melodic arrangement that really makes Tinker Tailor, Soldier Sailor, Rich Man, Poor Man, Beggar Man, Thief, really rescuing it from that fizzy, popping beat and muted keys that never really developed. Granted, the majority of these songs don't develop much. I was desperately hoping that we get a little bit more bombast and swell on Burn the Witch, or off the rickety groove on Dex Dark, or the krautrock crescendo on Full Stop, or off that richer synth and lower groove on Identikit, but we never really hit that climax point. Yeah, the guitar solo on Identikit was nice, but it's a shame that it felt completely unsupported by the rest of the mix. And that's where we get into the elephant in the room, namely that a lot of the melodic compositions and the smoother blends of guitar, synth, a little bit more eerie, and the semi-symphonic backing vocals remind me way too much of Steven Wilson. Now, in a sense, it's fine. I like Steven Wilson, and early Porcupine Tree albums did borrow from Radiohead, so I've got no problem with the reverse situation. But it also ignores that Steven Wilson took similar textures and not just added more of an edge, but allowed them to play off melodically, or at least build to something with a thicker, more ominous atmosphere. And it's bewildering that given the powerful feelings of melancholy that Thom Yorke is trying to convey vocally, that the atmosphere of so many of these mixes feels so tepid and lacking in real payoff, especially considering how muted and restrained so many of these keyboards are. They don't really build that deeper atmosphere. So okay, what saves this album from being worse? Honestly, might be the lyrics and themes. Like always, Thom Yorke's brand is often brutally simple, but a little bit abstract, and this requires a deeper listen in order to tie themes together. And considering that most of this album is comprised of songs that Radiohead has had in their set list for years, if not decades in the case of True Love Waits, you need a thematic connection to hold this album together. Initially, it's been a lot of speculation that it's focused on the separation of Thom Yorke from his wife. And yeah, you can definitely see that relationship melodrama creeping in. And note that I say melodrama here because there's not really a lot of emotional nuance in the writing. Thom Yorke is desperately trying to hold things together, but it can get awfully whiny at points, and at the very least it feels thinly sketched. But then we get songs like Burn the Witch and The Numbers, tracks that seem to be focused on climate change or scapegoating by the masses, or even being confronting with powers beyond oneself that are bigger than oneself on Dex Dark. And that's where the themes really start to materialize, and that ignorance is bliss. In typical Thom Yorke fashion, much of this album does retreat upon itself, but there's an undercurrent of how not knowing the truth might make things easier or better, at least emotionally. When you face reality, you have to deal with the pain or the very real crises staring you in the face. Sure, it's terrifying to stare into that moon-shaped pool, the reflection where the most discovery will actually take place about yourself and the situation you're now in, but ultimately it can at least help the process of moving on and growing up. And I wish that the sequencing of this album remotely paid these themes off. For some ungodly reason, this album is sequenced alphabetically, and makes for a listen where thematically it feels jumbled as hell. The arc to this album feels very misshapen and out of order, and it completely hurts very potent moments like the pretty damn good ballads Desert Island Disc or Glass Eyes. So look, as a whole, there are some beautiful moments here, but this record feels underwritten, underwhelming, and unsatisfying as a whole. I'm not going to deny that part of it was probably due to Radiohead picking up songs they've had in their set list for years, rather than recording a completely cohesive album from the very beginning with all new songs. But even if that was the case, the record would still probably feel scattershot and lacking dramatic payoff. Now, some will argue that that's the point. Facing the truth isn't always straightforward emotionally, but there's a way to approaching this sort of emotional decompression that can connect on a deeper level. Hell, Sufjan Stevens understood that with Carrie and Lowell, but that record also had an undercurrent of narrative subtext that could still be paid off. There was a satisfying conclusion there, at least on some level, whereas the subtext on A Moon-Shaped Pool was muddied and out of order. And the more I've listened to this album, the less I think that it comes together. So I'm thinking a strong 6 out of 10 and only a recommendation to hardcore Radiohead fans. Now, keep in mind, those Radiohead fans, that I've long accepted that this band is not for me. But you know what? Even fans, if they're being honest, can probably admit this is pretty far from Radiohead's best. They've definitely done better. But even with that, if you're a fan, you probably like it, so yeah, check it out, I guess. So yeah, thanks a lot for watching. I'd like to like and subscribe. I'd be more than grateful. I got the polls up there, so if you all want to tell me how wrong I am, there's your option. For anyone else, if you want me to improve my presentation or anything else I might be able to do to come up with any other albums, I'll be trying to fit them into my schedule. Things are lightening up a little bit, but I still got a pretty hefty list. Till then, I'm Mark, you're watching Spectrum Pulse, and I'll see you next time.